Well, it has finally happened. The long-awaited victory. Although not all southern units had yet ceased resistance, General Lee had already signed a surrender, which meant that the end of the war was a matter of the next few days, or weeks at most. And this obviously means that the Confederation ceases to exist and the United States remains a single state, no matter how much its enemies would like otherwise. The same British are probably not happy about what is happening now. They have bet too much on the Southern Allies in the hope of weakening their former colonies. Well, it's totally alright. They will have to go through it, since it's not harmful for the arrogant John Bull to teach painful lessons time to time. So thought the man standing at the window of the Oval Office in the White House, who looked at the lawn in front of the building. And although he looked imperturbable on the outside, deep down he was very pleased with what exactly took place. Abraham Lincoln reached the height of his fame, and while many people in the country curse him, he's much more admired and considered a great man than otherwise. Of course, history will judge them, and while there is time before today's performance, we can recall the path that led him first to politics and then to the heights of power. We've got a lot to tell since this path was long and truly difficult. This man became the 16th President of the United States and did not allow the country to split, guiding the North during the 4-year Civil War. And on January 1st, 1863, he abolished slavery throughout the United States, becoming one of the most popular leaders in almost a quarter of a millennium of its history. And he achieved this solely by his own efforts. He did not have any golden spoon in his mouth at birth. No. Where could it come from, the son of an uneducated farmer? So how he managed to do it? Probably we should let him tell about it himself. Even more so, his life was rich in events, and he clearly has something to share with descendants and observers. Today, we'll talk about a man who made one of the biggest, we can say, investments into the course of US history. The man who led the American North and whose rational mindset led him achieve what some would consider unachievable. Abraham Lincoln, the man of today's episode. Keep watching. Always seek new knowledge. Lincoln was born in the family of a wealthy farmer who himself owned a large amount of land, as well as movable and immovable property. But when small Abraham was 7 years old, his father lost everything he had acquired by his work, and the family had to pick up and go from Kentucky further north to Indiana. At that time, the frontier actions took place and everything was fine with free land. It could be taken without any issues. So the boy had to become a generalist worker from childhood, to do field work, cut wood, work at the post office, and work at the other places. He didn't have much free time and studied at school for only 1 year, but he learned to read and write, at the same time becoming addicted to reading books. His friends and even his father thought it was pretty strange, but young Abraham had by then learned the value of knowledge and its importance for his future career. Reading was simply essential. The fate of a farmer did not attract him, and he began to look for his way in life, along the way continuing self-education. By the way, he was engaged in it throughout his entire life. Until the age of 21, the young man lived with his family. But afterwards, he decided to see the world and went to travel along the Mississippi, earning his living by temporary work. He traveled to New Orleans and then returned to Illinois. Remembering these journeys, the president smiled. Then he had to read books at night by the light of a moon, since there wasn't enough money for anything else. However, this didn't stop the young man, and at the age of 23, he decided to try his luck in politics for the first time. He ran for the state parliament. But of course, a barely known young man was in for failure, which only spurred him on. Lincoln began to read and study law even more intensively. True, his income was bad and he often had to borrow until the next salary. However, he always paid off his debts, since he sincerely believed that honesty was the best behavior strategy. It's not surprising that those around him began to call him Honest Abe. Later, this nickname stayed with him. Have principles and always stand up for your beliefs. You can deceive some people all the time. You can deceive everyone for a while, but you can't deceive everyone all the time. Abe was ready to repeat these words he had once said, even though politics in his country had long since become a symbol of fraud. Yet he was never afraid to go against the mainstream and stand up for his own beliefs, even if it was to his impairment. As was the case in the late 1840s, when Lincoln was opposed to a war with Mexico supported by a majority of Americans. Because of this, he was forced to refuse re-election to the House of Representatives of Congress, but he nonetheless did not go against his conscience. Yes, gradually the career of the future president went up. He not only entered the American political cage, but also managed to pass the law exam at the age of 27. In this capacity, Lincoln showed his best side. He knew how to speak well in court and in general in front of the public. He knew the laws perfectly and also had an impeccable reputation. However, it happened to him by itself. He once remarked that person is like a tree and reputation is like its shadows. We care about the shade, but in fact, you need to think about the tree. But Abe may well not have become president. After his departure from the House of Representatives, he completely shut himself away from politics for several years, devoting himself entirely to the practice of law. It was successful for him. Soon he became one of the most famous lawyers in Illinois, whose services were needed by many. In a word, he did not need money and probably would have continued to follow this path. But then an important event happened. The Republican Party of the United States was created, and after a while, Lincoln joined its ranks. So what attracted him then in the new political force? Perhaps it was precisely because it was new, and also advocated the abolition of slavery in all states of the country. After all, he had been an opponent of this institution since his youth. The Bible clearly stated that there is neither Greek nor Jew, so blacks also had a soul, and therefore they had the right to personal freedom as well. In addition, slavery is very inefficient in economic terms. Forced laborers work under the stick and often run away from their masters. Intelligent people would have long understood that hiring free people was much more profitable than keeping slaves and spending money and human resources to control them. But sadly, most southern plantation holders were neither economically right nor morally right. Abraham was repeatedly convinced of this in his discussions with representatives of the southern states, although we must note that his views were not radical at all. For example, at that time he believed that questions about the permissibility of slavery were within the competence of the states, and the central government could not interfere in this. But there should be no slavery in the new territories of the country, and this outraged great many. For instance, in the late 1840s, the Wilmot Amendment, which he supported, did not pass in Congress, providing for just such a ban. The force of inertness turned out to be too great, and Lincoln didn't insist, convinced that it will do more good if you give way to a dog than if it bites you. Even if you kill a dog, you'll remain bitten. In other words, he for sure knew how to compromise, unlike many of his opponents and even like-minded people. Save and accumulate ideas. Although his speeches brought him wide fame throughout the country, and it's not surprising, Honest Abe not only knew how to talk, but also constantly thought about his speeches and manner of speech. While doing his business, he always kept paper and pencil with him, and when an idea came to mind, he immediately wrote it down. Later, when a lot of these ideas were accumulating, he sat down and systematized them. And then he began to discuss his ideas with a variety of people, with his wife, with neighbors, friends. The opinion of any person mattered to him. Lincoln always listened to criticism and objections, looking for counter-arguments as he laid out his thoughts. Therefore, by the moment he was about to be on a public introduction or discussion, he was ready for any turn of events and could respond to his opponent in the best possible way, which was quickly appreciated by those present at the time. President Abraham Lincoln. So when in May 1860 the Republicans nominated Lincoln as a presidential candidate, no one was particularly surprised, and he immediately gave his consent from his side. There were other candidates, but their agendas were way more radical, and Lincoln was supposed to be a compromise figure that would suit the Southern Americans as well. But the South did not accept his victory and was the first to start hostilities, for which the North was not ready. For the first 2 years, the fate of the country hung in the balance, and only then did the scale slowly tip in favor of the North. To do this, it was necessary to take unpopular measures. For example, to introduce universal military service. This led to unrest in New York, which quickly turned into real street battles with the police and then the army. The result was the death of several hundred people and the entry of the army into the city, which consequently suppressed the riots. Lincoln always took into account the changed circumstances and acted accordingly, and so it happened this time. Mr. President, the carriage has been served and it's time to go. Lincoln heard the voice of an assistant who entered the office. Well, we must soon end our story. The performance at the Ford Theater will begin soon, and Abraham Lincoln wants to attend it. But no matter what happened in the future, he had already played his role in history and was not afraid of its assessment by descendants. History needs legends, desperate feats and noble examples, fiery speeches, brave heroes and great victories. Winners forget betrayal and cowardice, hypocrisy and blood. Truth remains truth, and lies fade in history. These words of his came true in relation to Honest Abe himself. If you enjoyed watching this episode and want to watch more episodes like this, subscribe and leave a like. And now we have to go and prepare new great content for you.